Police find a frozen body in the Arizona desert. The chilling discovery sends investigators searching for more victims. A small town, a brutal murder, and a killer who could be anywhere. When all leads are exhausted, the investigation focuses on a blurry surveillance photo. When a young mother disappears, detectives are left with few clues. But slowly, the evidence begins to point to a dangerous and twisted predator. A lack of clues may cool down a hot investigation, but there's no statute of limitations on murder. Months or even years may pass before forensics can spark a fire under these cold cases. On June 3, 1991, investigators from the Costa Mesa, California Police Department pulled up to an abandoned car on the Corona del Mar freeway. They were responding to a call regarding a missing person, Denise Hubert, age 23. No one had seen or heard from her for almost 24 hours, and that wasn't like her. Denise's best friend had found her car on the side of the road while searching for her. Investigators examined it closely, but aside from a flat tire, nothing seemed amiss. The only personal article they found was a pair of pantyhose on the front seat. Denise preferred to drive without them. Though nothing in the car tipped investigators about what had happened, Detective Ron Smith concluded that Denise ran into trouble soon after she had pulled off the road.
What struck us as unusual about the scene and concerned us right from the very beginning was that very near to her car, there were emergency call boxes, there were pay phones, there were all-night convenience stores, none of which Denise went to call her parents or to ask for help. We knew right away that something was amiss, something was wrong.
The last person who saw Denise was her date from the night before. She had dropped him off after a concert. Denise never made it home. Bright, popular, just graduated from college, she wasn't the type to worry her parents by going off without a call or note. Her family and friends started to look for her the next morning. After recovering her car, the Costa Mesa police launched a massive search for Denise Hubert. They notified law enforcement agencies across the country. They followed up every clue, every lead. Denise's friends and family put up posters and appeared on news programs begging for information. As the months and years passed, the tips dried up. But police kept Denise's case open and as active as they could.
Every day we would do something with the Denise Hubert case. We would review old leads, we'd go over old reports again. We'd look one more time at the photographs. We never gave up, even though we never really had anything good to work with.
After 3 years, no one could tell her grieving family and friends what had happened to her. Denise Hubert had simply vanished. Meanwhile, more than 300 miles away in Arizona's Prescott Valley, authorities were grappling with a mystery of their own. On July 9th, 1994, a woman went to buy paint at the home of a man she met at a swap meet. While she waited for him, she noticed a padlocked rental truck and the paint and chemical cans cluttering his yard. She thought they looked out of place for such a respectable neighborhood and wondered if any laws were being broken. Suspicious, she called a friend who worked for the police. Her friend thought it sounded like a clandestine drug lab, which police find in the most unlikely spots. He sent investigators from the Yavapai County Sheriff's Department to check it out. The rental truck with the California tags looked like it hadn't been moved in months. The electrical cord snaking out of it and the paint cans all around reinforced the notion that this might be a mobile drug lab. A check of the tag showed the truck had been stolen. Armed with a warrant, police cautiously opened the cargo door. Inside was a freezer.
Ready, guys? We're opening up.
Not knowing what it might contain, they suited up in protective gear. Plastic bags obscured the contents, but at the bottom of the freezer lay a pool of frozen blood. Carefully moving the bags aside, the officers expected to find nothing more than a deer. Instead, Lieutenant Scott Masher uncovered a horrific mystery.
Initially, when we opened the black bags and could tell that we had a human, a frozen body with handcuffs behind the back, ice crystals, it was grim.
The homeowner still hadn't returned, so police ran the license plates on the white pickup, also parked in the driveway. The owner was identified as John Joseph Famolaro. Within an hour, Famolaro and his mother pulled up to the house. Sheriff's deputies took Famolaro into custody, charging him with stealing the rental truck. They were anxious to find out more about the body in the freezer. Mrs. Famolaro, who lived next door, told detectives that her son was a house painter, which explained the paint cans. She said the truck had been parked there about 2 months. She didn't know anything about the freezer or its contents, except that the electricity in John's house had been turned off for 1 day, and he had asked to run a power cord from her house to the truck. At the police station, Famolaro was polite but uncooperative. He refused to answer any questions and asked to see his lawyer. Without any assistance from their suspect, investigators would have to rely on physical evidence at the scene to identify the body in the freezer and to find out how it got there. They charged Famolaro with homicide. The next day, warrant in hand, investigators entered Famolaro's house, hoping to find information about the victim in the freezer. In its frozen condition, they couldn't even discern the victim's gender.
Look through these things on the chair.
Famolaro's house was crammed with his belongings. This was the home of a man who never threw anything away.
I think that's an interesting thing.
This one piece will make 52 layers.
Watch on mobile devices or the big screen. All for free. No subscription required.
If clues were here, they'd be difficult to find. After more than 2 weeks of searching, investigators found several promising clues. The first was a set of handcuff keys that matched the cuffs on the victim.
Bag it and tag it. Okay.
The next clue took investigators by surprise. 2 complete Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department uniforms. In the garage, the deputies found 2 boxes marked Christmas, but there was nothing merry about them. Inside, officers found blood-stained women's clothing and a bloody hammer and nail puller. They also found a pair of women's shoes, the backs badly scuffed, as though the woman who wore them was dragged.
Get a couple bags here. A shot of this hammer.
And that wasn't all.
One for
We did locate numerous female identifications. That included Social Security cards, I believe some driver's license, and other identification, obviously raising the concern of maybe we had additional victims.
Yavapai County Police had to face the very real possibility that John Famolero was a serial killer. Arizona investigators looking into a murder had every reason to believe that there may be more than one victim. To test that theory, investigators brought in cadaver dogs to locate more bodies on John Famolero's property. The dogs, trained to detect the slightest whiff of decay, alerted their handlers several times. Officers dug up every spot and still found nothing. But they never completely gave up the suspicion that the killer had struck before.
I just got the paperwork from Costa Mesa.
Police followed up on every piece of ID found in the Christmas boxes. Much to their relief, they found that each woman was alive and accounted for, except one from Costa Mesa, California. Her name was Denise Hubert. To confirm her ID, Yavapai County forensic technician Mike Winnie lifted a thumbprint from the thawing victim and compared it with the one printed on Denise Hubert's California driver's license. The prints matched, identifying Hubert as the victim. To authorities in Arizona, the name meant nothing. But to Costa Mesa detective Ron Smith, it was the news he had waited 3 anxious years to hear.
The call I received from Lieutenant Scott Masher from Yavapai County was that he thought maybe he had a body identified as Denise Hubert and asked us if we were familiar with Denise Hubert. Well, of course, I almost fell out of my chair when he mentioned the name.
Now that she had been found, investigators in Arizona had to determine how she had been killed. Working with the frozen and decomposed remains presented a unique set of challenges to Maricopa County Medical Examiner Ann Buchholz.
In our environment, to examine a frozen body is very unusual. We deal 99% of the time with people who have been exposed to heat elements, and that is more our area of expertise than someone who has been in a cold environment. It took the body approximately 2 days to thaw, where we could actually perform the internal examination.
On Friday, July 16, 1994, Yavapai detective Scott Masher and Costa Mesa detective Ron Smith, along with other officers, gathered in the medical examiner's lab to observe the autopsy. The cause of death was determined to be blunt force trauma to the skull, resulting in multiple fractures. To identify the murder weapon, investigators needed to evaluate the entire skull to see where and how the blows had been struck. They called in forensic anthropologist Laura Fulginiti.
How many days are we looking at here?
Reconstructing a person's skull is very similar to doing a jigsaw puzzle. Essentially, you have about 50 pieces and you need to put them back into what you know to be the right composition.
It took Fulginiti 2 days to reconstruct the skull, never losing sight of the fact that this victim was once a person.
And I remember standing in this very room thinking to myself, how did you come to be in my sphere? This is not right. It's not natural for you to be here.
She determined that the victim had sustained more than 35 blows to the head. The wounds were consistent with the hammer and nail puller pulled from the box in Famillaro's garage. To be certain, the lab ran tests. Technicians were able to establish a DNA profile from the blood residue on the nail puller. It matched the DNA profile taken of the victim's own blood. The match confirmed that they had found the murder weapon. To build their case, investigators had to retrace the events that led from the victim's abandoned car on a California freeway to John Famillaro's freezer in Arizona.
Covered initially as far as the search warrants at this point.
It was very important for both agencies, the Yavapai County Sheriff's Office and the Costa Mesa Police Department, to work together and piece the evidence from California and Arizona to one case, one solid case, in order to successfully prosecute this.
The Costa Mesa Police Department gathered information on Famillaro's activities during the time he lived in California. They learned that he had attended the Los Angeles Sheriff's Department Reserve Academy, but he couldn't make the grade and dropped out after just a few weeks. He kept his uniforms, which police found at his house. Further investigation led detectives to a warehouse in Laguna Hills, 12 miles from where Denise Hubert's empty car was found. John Famillaro had stored some paint and supplies in the warehouse, then moved everything out when he left the area in August 1992, 13 months after Denise Hubert vanished. Investigators thought it was likely that Famillaro had committed the murder here. They hoped to recover forensic evidence that would tie the killer to the crime and determine where the killer's trial would take place. Police searched the unit for evidence of the crime, using luminol to expose traces of blood. Applied to a surface and viewed under an alternate light source, luminol reveals blood stains invisible to the naked eye, even traces left years earlier.
We found that the warehouse was huge, but I wanted every square inch luminol for blood. Almost the very last bottle in the very last corner that we looked, we sprayed luminol into the corner against the wall. And all of a sudden, the luminol just lit up. This bright glow showed us we found what we were looking for.
Technicians compared this blood to a sample taken from the victim in Arizona. They matched. The forensic analysis gave Detective Smith of the Costa Mesa Police the proof he needed to make the case.
The forensic science in testing the blood was absolutely critical. Number one, it established that the crime occurred in California, and that established jurisdiction. It also positively identified that blood as Denise. It put Denise at that scene.
Famillaro never confessed. The forensic evidence spoke for him. The investigators had successfully matched the blood in the California storage unit to the victim in Arizona, and that placed the victim within deadly proximity of John Famillaro. Authorities believe that Hubert pulled off the road with a flat tire. Spotting his prey, John Famillaro approached under the guise of lending a helping hand. He abducted Denise Hubert in Costa Mesa, California, in the early morning of June 3, 1991. Famillaro murdered her sometime later, hid her body in a freezer, trucked it to Arizona, and kept it until police discovered his crime 3 years later. John Famillaro was sentenced to death. He awaits execution on California's death row. Famillaro hid his crime by keeping the body close to him. Other killers are not so conniving, but they can be equally elusive. It was a December evening in 1990. Peggy Phillips wondered why her husband Dean was taking so long to lock up the laundrette they owned in Ozona, Texas. It was just next door, but he'd been gone 20 minutes.
Dean?
She found him lying on the floor, bleeding and barely conscious. Police and paramedics raced to save him. Peggy thought that Dean must have fallen and hit his head. But the paramedics could see that this was no accident. Dean Phillips had been beaten nearly to death. Peggy watched as the paramedics loaded her husband into the ambulance. It was the last time she saw him alive. Dean Phillips died early the next morning, December 26th. The cause of death? Blunt force trauma to the head. Investigators determined that Phillips had interrupted a burglary and paid dearly for it. They found only one hard clue, a single fingerprint lifted from a coin box left on the floor. They sent the print to the Texas Department of Public Safety. Like small-town police departments all over Texas, the Ozona police depended on the DPS crime lab for forensic services. This time, though, the Department of Public Safety came up empty. The coin box fingerprint didn't match anything they had on file. News of Dean Phillips's death spread through Ozona. Crockett County Chief Deputy Sheriff Alton Davis was determined to catch the criminal who had shattered the quiet of this little town.
We've got a population of probably 3,000 to 4,000 people, so it's a small town. Everybody knows everybody, and it was a real shock to the community that something like this could happen in Ozona.
The community stepped forward to help the investigation. A witness reported seeing two local men wearing bloody clothes the night Phillips was killed. A warrant was obtained, and their bloody clothes were confiscated before they had time to launder them. Brought in for questioning, the men claimed they were hunters and that the blood was from a deer they had poached.
Last night we had a very serious
Investigators were skeptical until they got confirmation from the DPS crime lab.
Let's get to the question. What time did you
The
get
blood
the call?
was indeed from a deer,
10:30.
and the men's fingerprints didn't match the one lifted from the coin box at Phillips's laundry. The case's first promising tip amounted to nothing. A clerk at a convenience store right off the interstate gave investigators their next lead.
You got a couple of minutes I can talk to you?
Yes.
A man came in an hour before the murder and asked where the launderette was.
And we're just checking the neighborhood.
She described him as stocky, with dirty blonde hair and a t-shirt with radio call letters.
Oh, yeah? Oh, what time was that?
He drove a beat-up blue van with a green door on the passenger side. There may have been a passenger in the van. Investigators hope to see the suspect on the store's surveillance tape.
Okay, good.
Okay.
Okay? Listen, you have a good evening. Thanks a lot.
But the security camera was old. The man's face was a blur. Neither the DPS nor the FBI could enhance the image electronically. The investigators were convinced they had their suspect on this tape, but his image, like their chances of finding him, were dim.
How you doing today?
As the investigation into the murder of Dean Phillips continued, Witnesses reported seeing a strange blue van in town the night of the murder. Some thought they saw two people in it. Sheriff Alton Davis believed that Phillips's killer was a stranger just passing through town.
Ozona is right on Interstate 10, or more or less out in the middle of nowhere. This is the first one we've had where someone has came off the interstate and murdered one of our local people.
Investigators knew the killer was probably hundreds of miles away by now. And then they got the call. A van, matching the one described by the witnesses, was stopped about 200 miles west of town. Davis sped to the scene.
We found an old GMC van, light blue, that had a dark passenger door on it, dark primer colored. And we took photographs of the van. We talked to there was a Hispanic male driving it, which didn't fit the description of our suspect.
The case had run into another dead end. Reviewing the clues they'd gathered so far, investigators realized that all they had to go on was a blurry surveillance tape and a store clerk's fading recollection. They needed some way to turn these hazy clues into solid information. Then they recalled Karen Taylor, an experienced forensic artist with the Special Crimes Service of the Texas DPS. Taylor had worked with the Ozona police on missing persons cases. She is a pioneer in the forensic art and science of facial reconstruction, developing witnesses' vague descriptions into recognizable faces of criminal suspects.
My function is to take some bit of information from a crime that occurs, produce some sort of a visual image that can be put out in the media, and hopefully it will trigger additional information that can be used to connect the crime to the victim or connect the crime to the suspect.
Ozona police sent Taylor stills taken from the videotape. But after she had evaluated the black and white photos, she wasn't sure she'd be able to help.
So I had a look at those stills to see just what I could determine about the face. It was very blurry, the quality was pretty poor, so I could see that there wasn't much likelihood we could enhance that video electronically, and it would probably boil down to my trying to just do some sort of a sketch based on what I could see.
Taylor knew that while every feature might not be rendered perfectly, the sketch's resemblance to the suspect would be strong enough to help the investigation.
Well, after years of doing this, I've come to believe that the most important thing to capture in a face for a forensic artist to trigger recognition is getting the proportions right. Each of the component parts in a face, each of the features, the eyes, nose, mouth, is important, but it's not as important as the arrangement of those features on a face.
Taylor wasn't sure the image had enough information for her to work from. Then she noticed a feature she'd overlooked: the store clerk. She had talked with the suspect face to face. Taylor hoped the clerk might provide the missing details she needed to sharpen the picture.
Using the video stills, I prepared as much of a drawing as I could, maybe 85% done, and then faxed it to the witness, got on the phone with her, and she was able to make some changes. She said she wanted me to make the eyes look light, make the lower face look more slim, and I did that. We hung up. I spent about 15 minutes making those alterations, and then I refaxed it to her, and she checked it and said, yes, that's right. So I was able to get the benefit of her long-distance input over the phone and using the fax.
Here he was, the most likely suspect in the murder of Dean Phillips. The Crockett County Sheriff's Office prepared a crime bulletin. Karen Taylor's drawing of the suspect's face was circulated across the country and to every radio station where someone might recognize the call letters on the suspect's shirt. Taylor's drawing represented the investigation's last hope. But when all the publicity brought no response, the Dean Phillips murder case came to a dead halt. The beating death of Dean Phillips looked like it was destined to go unsolved. Sheriff Alton Davis and his team had exhausted their last leads.
Eventually, we'd ruled everybody out we were getting, and the leads stopped coming in, and we didn't have anything to work on, and it just more or less went cold, and we just had to sit until we got some other type of leads.
5 years came and went without another clue or lead. But Peggy Phillips was determined to bring her husband's murderer to justice. She contacted a television crime show and asked if they'd run her story. In August 1996, just over 5.5 years after Phillips was killed, the TV show aired the story of his murder and featured Karen Taylor's drawing. That's what got the phones ringing. From around the country, viewers called in leads. Texas Ranger Jerry Byrne fielded the calls and directed the investigation. One tip led him to Paul Wesley Taylor, a convict at Utah's minimum security prison in Draper. Ranger Byrne contacted Draper Prison and asked for Taylor's records and a photograph. When he saw it, Byrne felt that at last they had tracked down their suspect.
The photograph of Paul Wesley Taylor was nearly identical to a composite drawing that a DPS artist had conducted back in 1991. Initially, I felt like it was too good to be true.
Byrne sent Taylor's records and fingerprint card to the DPS. They matched Taylor's right ring finger with the coin box fingerprint. After years without progress, this was a giant step forward. Investigators went back to the original set of clues, looking for more connections to the suspect. They found out that Taylor's brother worked at a radio station with the call letters seen on Taylor's shirt. They were now certain Paul Wesley Taylor was involved with the murder of Dean Phillips. But they wanted to know about the van's passenger, a witness, or possibly an accomplice to Phillips's murder. Taylor's arrest records showed that his girlfriend had been with him at the time of his arrest in Georgia. Georgia authorities located the woman. Her answers filled the remaining gaps in the case against Taylor. She told Ranger Byrne that they had traveled through Texas during December 1990 and that Taylor had pulled up outside of a laundrette and gone in. She saw him fighting, and he returned to the van with blood on his shirt. And she certainly didn't know that anyone had been killed.
He never said that he killed him?
She led investigators to a field where Taylor had ditched his bloody clothes, along with a stolen coin box. They now had a credible witness who placed Taylor in the laundrette at the time of the murder. Utah extradited Paul Wesley Taylor back to Texas. On September 15, 1998, nearly 8 years after the killing, he pled guilty to the capital murder of Dean Phillips. On the 21st, he was sentenced to life in prison. Forensic artist Karen Taylor had turned a single blurry photograph into an image that helped unmask and apprehend a bald-faced killer.
When that photograph and drawing were presented, they knew that it was Paul Wesley Taylor. That photograph and that composite drawing is what broke this case open.
Investigators speculate that Paul Wesley Taylor got off the interstate in Ozona to get some food and gas. Short of money, Taylor got the idea to knock over the laundrette after closing time. Dean Phillips was in the wrong place at the wrong time. In other cases, tragedy stalks its victims. August 16, 1989, Joe Gilbreth finished work and arrived at his home in Villanau, Georgia. He was looking forward to spending the evening with his baby girl, Amber, and his wife, Nikia. He noticed that his wife's car was gone. This was odd. Nikia was usually home fixing supper at this hour. When he went inside, he started to worry. Nikia would never let Amber sit in her pajamas all day, and there was no way she'd ever leave the baby in the house by herself. The doors were unlocked and didn't look like they had been tampered with. When Nikia's family told Joe they hadn't heard from her, he called the police.
Nikia!
The Walker County Sheriff's Department sent officers to investigate.
Check the residence and you don't see her, and you're on the
Joe and his mother-in-law reported 3 missing items: a blue telephone cord that had been ripped from the wall, a bedspread that had a sheet stitched to one side, and all of Nikia's underwear. Based on what he found in the house, Detective Pat Bedford believed that Nikia Gilbreth's disappearance was more sinister than the simple missing persons case he was originally sent to investigate.
My first impressions are, she was taken out of here bound. Somebody forcibly was taking her from this residence. When you tie that into the fact that it was realized that a whole drawer full of her undergarments and lingerie was missing, it makes you think that we're dealing with a serious crime here.
Checked around, see if there's anything missing by chance. Took a shower.
Joe Gilbreth told the police that the day had started like any other.
I checked all the house and I could.
The alarm went off at 5:30. Joe got up and got ready for work. Nikia went back to bed. And by 6 a.m., the house was quiet. Joe and the baby were the last to have seen Nikia. A squad car was stationed at the house in case she might return, but Nikia never came home. On August 18, 1989, the day after she had disappeared, the Walker County Sheriff's Department had little to go on.
We got a tragedy here. We got a problem. At first, no good leads to follow up on. Her car had not been located. She had not been located. Didn't appear to have any leads from talking to neighbors and searching the immediate area. We had nothing at that point.
But that soon changed when Nikia's mother found her daughter's car abandoned on a logging road a half-mile north of the Gilbreth house. Investigators hoped they'd find clues to help locate her. Technicians raised fingerprints all over the car, but they belonged to members of the Gilbreth family. Officers found indications of a second car parked next to Nikia's. It was an ominous sign, but the tire impression wasn't distinct enough to photograph or print. Nikia's mother noted that the baby quilt Nikia always kept in the back seat was missing, and that was it. Nothing at the scene offered a clue of what had happened to Nikia or where she might be now. Still, her family held out hope that she'd come back to them unharmed. Though investigators believed she was a victim of foul play, they had no evidence and no suspects. Joe had passed a polygraph indicating that he wasn't involved. All they had were a few missing items and an abandoned car, but still no sign of Nikia. Two days later, a boy collecting empty cans along the highway made a crucial, gruesome discovery. body was too decomposed for a positive visual ID, though it was a white female about Nikia's size, with the clothes and jewelry Joe had described. Dental records confirmed everyone's worst fears. The autopsy determined that Nikia had died from asphyxiation. The examination also revealed marks around her wrists and ankles, marks that could have been made with telephone cord. But there was no other significant forensic evidence. No hairs or fibers, no fingerprints on the body. Nothing that might dictate the investigation's next step. Investigators considered a number of suspects, but none of them panned out. Leads dried up. The case went cold.
Unfortunately, we were going nowhere in the case. We had no good leads, no good suspects. Any tips that we got, we did everything from roadblocks, car to car, house to house, door to door searches, searched the area thoroughly. We weren't able to really locate anything that was helping us. Several months went by and we really weren't making any progress in solving this case. You cannot let something like this go on. You've got to be able to solve this case.
Then, 4 months after Nikia Gilbreth disappeared, investigators heard about a similar case in nearby Gordon County. A young woman was abducted by an intruder while her child slept. For 14 hours, he forced her to model lingerie for him and assaulted her repeatedly. Then, he brought her back home. Before police could identify the woman's assailant, the case took a bizarre turn. The investigation into the death of Nikia Gilbreth had led to a similar account of a woman's abduction. The connection was weak, but it was their only lead. 2 days after the assault, the woman's father reported to police that he saw a strange man drop off a Christmas tree at her house. When investigators ran the truck's license plate, they discovered that it was registered to James Ray Ward. He worked for a nearby well drilling company. The woman picked out Ward's picture from a photo lineup. She recalled that during the day she was being held, she told her assailant that she hadn't had a chance to get her child a Christmas tree. Officers took Ward into custody a short time later. Ward pled guilty to rape and was just starting a 20-year prison term. In their check into his whereabouts prior to his arrest, police learned that Ward had drilled a well at the Gilbreths a year earlier. Then he returned to check on it in July 1989, just a month before Nikia was killed. Ward's employer said that drillers were never sent back to check on wells. Ward had acted on his own. The similarities between the abduction of his rape victim and the abduction of Nikia Gilbreth provided police with their only lead. When officers searched the home Ward shared with his wife and children, they found a stash of women's undergarments that didn't belong to Ward's wife. Detectives also uncovered a receipt for well drilling made out to the Gilbreths. But it was much more than a receipt.
Had directions, the road name, the mileage that would have led me right to the Gilbreth residence. The description of the victim he had written in there matched her description, including an age of a daughter that the victim had. Then we had our first direct link from the murder to a suspect.
Investigators also found items missing from the Gilbreths' home. A bathing suit bottom, a baby quilt, a bedspread, and a blue telephone cord.
Got it. Phone cord.
In order to build the strongest case against Ward, investigators needed to prove premeditation. They obtained a statement Ward had written regarding the abduction he'd pled guilty to. They wanted to compare this writing sample with the incriminating notes jotted on the Gilbreth's receipt found in his home. Document examiner Karen Scott performed the analysis.
A handwriting comparison is basically a side-by-side comparison. I look for features in the writing of one set and I see if I find the same thing in the other set. And I'm looking for things like how the letters are on the piece of paper, how they're formed, how they're spaced.
Scott looks for the idiosyncrasies, the little details that give a person's handwriting its individual character.
For instance, the F in the word fine, it's very short, the very bottom of it. The D in the word road and side are written opposite the way people are taught. Staff first and then the round part. While this is not in and of itself a unique just to this writer, it is not the way it was taught to be done.
After comparing the note with Ward's known handwriting, Scott was confident that both documents were written by the same person. Investigators then examined the bedspread, quilt, and bathing suit bottom found in Ward's house. Nikia's mother supplied the matching top, which she found in the Gilbreth's home. Because hundreds of identical bathing suits were manufactured and sold, the prosecution had to prove that the bottom found at Ward's and the top found at the Gilbreth's were parts of the same suit. To make that assessment, the lab had to compare the amount of fiber wear on both parts of the suit. They concluded that the bottom matched the top. The suit belonged to Nikia Gilbreth. The investigation turned to the other two items, the bedspread and the baby quilt. Before she even put them under a microscope, trace evidence technician Terry Santamaria recognized their significance.
I knew that these types of bedspreads did not come commercially from the manufacturer with a sheet sewn to it, so I knew that the item had been altered by somebody. After determining that, I then examined the baby quilt. When I pulled the baby quilt out, I immediately recognized that this was homemade.
Santamaria called Detective Bedford. These two items, the bedspread and the blanket, were absolutely unique, one-of-a-kind items. They were a direct link from the suspect's home back to the victim. This evidence completed the case against James Ray Ward. At Ward's trial, Nikia's mother-in-law testified that she had stitched the sheet onto the bedspread to cover the rough cloth and had sewn the baby quilt for her granddaughter. The only way that they could have come into Ward's possession was if he had gone into the Gilbreth home and Nikia's car and taken them. Ward never confessed, but based on the evidence, investigators pieced together a scenario for the murder. On the morning of August 17th, Ward watched Joe Gilbreth leave for work. When he saw it was safe, he entered the Gilbreth home and abducted Nikia.
I believe he pulled the telephone wires and the cord away from the wall. I believe he bound her, wrapped her in the quilt, and on the way out the door also took a drawer full of her underwear and lingerie as a trophy.
Prosecutors called Ward a meticulous, organized stalker with a perverted mind. Investigators speculated that he fantasized that the women he was assaulting liked him. That might explain why he returned to place a Christmas tree at the door of one of his victims' homes. Jurors convicted him of murder, and in July 1991, after deliberating just 3 hours, he was sentenced to death for murdering Nikia Gilbreth. When the leads disappear and an investigation stalls, that doesn't mean a case is closed. In a homicide, investigators have an arsenal of forensic techniques and all the time in the world to catch the killer. When a wealthy family is murdered in their home, it looks like a professional hit, until investigators begin to suspect it was really the work of a gifted amateur. The investigation into the drowning death of a woman in Pennsylvania sends ripples out as far as North Carolina, where some dark secrets begin to surface. Detectives on the case of a murdered woman get more than they bargained for when they uncover a sinister family business. Every family has its problems. Every household has its secrets. But when the skeletons in the closet are real, forensics is called upon to get to the bottom of those family plots. On Easter Sunday, 1992, the Ewell family was wrapping up a weekend getaway at their beach house. Dana, a 20-year-old college student, bade farewell to his older sister Tiffany and his parents, Dale and Glee. Dana stayed behind to spend the evening with his girlfriend's family, while the others made the 200-mile trek back to Fresno.
See you home. Have a nice flight.
It was the last time Dana would see them alive. 2 days later, when he couldn't get his family on the phone, Dana called a neighbor to check on the house. The neighbor, accompanied by the Ewell's housekeeper, made a gruesome discovery. Mr. Ewell lay dead on the floor. He appeared to have been shot in the back of the head. As investigators from the Fresno County Sheriff's Department searched the house, they realized that Dale wasn't the only victim. His daughter Tiffany and his wife Glee were also found dead. Like her father, Tiffany had been killed execution style, ambushed with a single bullet to the back of the head. But Glee had known what was coming. It seemed that she had tried to run before bullets to the back and shoulder stopped her. The gunpowder residue on her sweatshirt told investigators that the killer had then fired into her body at close range. Based on the condition of the victims, investigators knew that the Ewells must have been killed almost immediately after they returned from the beach 2 days earlier. 5 spent slugs were collected from the crime scene. 1 more was found in Glee's body. In the master bedroom, investigators found an opened box of 9mm ammunition and an empty gun case. The owner's manual showed that the missing weapon was a Browning 9mm pistol. Since much of the house was ransacked, detectives first theorized that this was a burglary attempt gone awry. But the evidence didn't support that theory.
No, looks like an amateur job.
There was no forced entry. Many valuable items, including Dale Ewell's gun collection, were left in the home. Rather than use pillowcases to collect the loot, bed sheets were laid out and loaded up with worthless items like audio cassettes and coins. To homicide detective John Souza, even though the killers slipped in and out without notice, it just didn't look like a professional burglary.
A good burglar searches dressers and stuff by starting from the bottom and going up. That way he has to never have to close a drawer. He opens the bottom one, he searches it, he opens the next one, and they all stay open. Where here was a combination of everything. There was no pattern at all.
The crime had been planned out to a T. Though many neighbors were in their backyards on Easter Sunday, no one noticed anything strange at the Ewell house, nor had they heard gunshots. Given the amount of forethought that must have gone into the murders, detectives could not discount a professional hit. Nor could they overlook the prospect that someone might be coming back to finish off the sole family survivor, Dana Ewell.
Glad to have you in.
He returned from school and met with investigators. If he feared for his life, he was hiding it, along with his grief.
Really appreciate that.
He's been just told that his family is dead, all his family. There's not a tear. And it just amazed me. I'm going, well, I'll give him the benefit of the doubt, maybe he's in shock.
He told police that his mother had once worked for the Central Intelligence Agency. His father, who owned an airplane dealership, had a reputation as a ruthless businessman. As Dale's $8 million fortune grew over the years, it seemed likely that he'd made some enemies. Investigators delved into the family's personal and financial background, probing for dark secrets. None were found. Glee's history as a translator with the CIA was uneventful, and though many people seem to have disliked Dale Ewell, none had a motive to kill him and his family.
What's this?
Our lab technician.
Dana was asked to inspect the house, keeping an eye out for anything missing.
As you can see the blood stains here, but we're not sure whose blood that was.
Detectives noticed that he seemed unaffected by the blood-stained carpet. But he became indignant when he saw that investigators had damaged a light fixture.
What happened here? Did your people do this?
Immediately after the funeral, he started spending money. He lavished his girlfriend with expensive gifts and purchased a $130,000 plane for himself. It was suspicious behavior, but Dana had an alibi. During the murder, he said, he'd been 4 hours away with his girlfriend's family. The girl's father, an FBI agent, confirmed it.
If you could take
Dana stood to gain millions of dollars from his family's death, but his perfect alibi meant that he couldn't have been the shooter. Detectives hoped that forensics would help find out who was. But there was little to go on. No footprints or fingerprints. Even the shells had been removed. The only physical evidence was the 6 9mm bullets expended at the crime scene. All hope of solving the case rested in the hands of ballistics experts at the Fresno County Sheriff's Department. The crime lab determined that the bullets had come from the box of ammunition found in the victim's nightstand. Identical scratch patterns told investigators that all 6 bullets had been fired through the same barrel. But when these marks were compared with ones from a Browning pistol like the one stolen from the Ewell's house, investigators found an obvious discrepancy. The scratches that indicate rate of twist didn't match. Rate of twist is the distance it takes a bullet to complete a single rotation. The Browning has a rate of twist of 10 inches, but the murder bullets showed a 12-inch rate of twist. For criminalist Alan Boudreau, there was no mistaking the findings.
To me, that finished the issue. It's not a Browning pistol that fired the murder bullets.
But these weren't the only marks on the slugs. Each of the 6 bullets bore deep scratches. Boudreau was puzzled by these peculiar marks.
I'd never really seen anything like that before, although I had about 24, 25 years experience.
Enlargements of the bullet markings were sent to law enforcement labs throughout the country, but none was familiar with the etchings or the unusual rate of twist. 6 bullets had been fired, yet no one had heard shots. Unusual gun barrel marks had etched a mysterious signature onto the resulting slugs. This suggested that the weapon had been modified, perhaps by a silencer. But the Sheriff's Department had little experience with them.
I've never come across where someone had used a silencer. Silencers not, I mean, they're used and you see them on TV a lot, but I think it's more movie drama than actually in real life. Silencers are not used in crimes, and so that was kind of unusual in itself.
Before, Souza had only theorized that murder was the motivation. If a silencer had been used, he now had the physical proof.
You got a silencer, you got a killer that came to the house to kill people. That was the sole purpose.
After their ballistics analysis, investigators studied the microscopic residue from Glee's sweatshirt. It's common to find gunmetal residue near close-range shots, but this one contained an unusual mix of rubber, steel wool, and bright yellow fibers. The forensics team couldn't identify the source of these materials, but knew that they had somehow been used to modify the weapon. Their findings corroborated the silencer theory. They proved that on Easter night, someone had entered the Ewell home with a deadly agenda. He ransacked the house to make it look like a burglary and stole the victim's gun to throw detectives off track. But he had used ammunition he found in the home. And that meant the killer would have had to know there was a box of 9mm ammunition stashed in Dale Ewell's nightstand. Only a handful of people had intimate knowledge of the house, and 3 of them were dead. Detectives probed more deeply into Dana's background. College classmates at Santa Clara described him as a preppy, clean-cut loner, obsessed with wealth. So it was odd, they thought, that he'd been best friends with a student named Joel Radovsich, who was nearly kicked out of school for stealing furniture. Joel seemed defensive with investigators. He told them that he barely knew Dana. His whereabouts on Easter Sunday could not be confirmed.
Look, I already told y'all I know. I don't know anything about him.
Surveillance on Dana showed that Joel moved into the Ewell home 2 months after the murders and lived there until the following October. During that time, Dana paid his friends bills and treated him to thousands of dollars worth of helicopter lessons. Yet when Dana was asked about Joel, he denied knowing him. Detectives had caught both young men in a bald-faced lie. They needed to find out what else they might be lying about. More than a year after the triple homicide of a wealthy Fresno family, detectives still didn't have enough evidence to prove that Dana Ewell and Joel Radovsich were involved. And the pair was well aware of that fact. When Dana returned to Santa Clara the following spring, they communicated only through beepers and payphones. Dana was skilled at dodging the detectives.
Dana was always looking over his shoulder, very cautious. He would go to the Jet Center in San Jose Airport, and they had insulated booths, payphone booths, and most of the calls were from those. And you couldn't even stand outside the booth and hear what was being said.
Joel wasn't as careful. He was overheard telling Dana that he was worried about what the investigators might have on them. Unfortunately, it wasn't enough to tie the young men to the murders. Investigators obtained a search warrant for a duplicate beeper so that they could monitor Joel's pages. Weeks passed without any suspicious calls.
Find out who it is.
Then, in October 1993, Joel got a page from a man detectives knew very little about. His name was Jack Ponce.
Okay, there it is.
He and Joel used to go target shooting together. Ponce admitted that just 11 days before the Ewell murders, he had purchased a Feather Industries 9mm semi-automatic rifle. He said he bought it to kill opossums. Detectives thought that was an odd choice of weapon, and when they asked to see it, Ponce said that the gun had been stolen. If investigators could somehow tie the missing rifle to the bullets and residue from the crime scene, they'd be able to connect Radovsich and Ewell to the triple homicide. Ponce, realizing he was implicated in the murders, turned state's evidence.
The magazine for it.
He admitted that he'd purchased the rifle for Joel. Days later, Joel told Ponce he'd killed the Ewells and asked him to dispose of the weapon. Ponce threw it away. The murder weapon was gone, but another piece of the puzzle fell into place when investigators learned that Dana had purchased a book on how to build a homemade silencer.
I purchased the same books that he had purchased, and brought them home, and of course I gave them to Alan Boudreau and says, make a silencer per this book.
Boudreau built a silencer to the book's specifications. Among the materials were tennis balls and steel wool, consistent with the residue found on Glee Ewell's sweatshirt. But the real proof was in the firing. For that, they'd need the gun. After interviewing 90 firearms manufacturers worldwide, investigators discovered that the rare Feather Industries rifle is the only 9mm manufactured with a 12-inch rate of twist. Even though he didn't have Ponce's rifle, Boudreau could still perform tests on other weapons of the same model. He spent months tracking down 9mm Feathers with serial numbers close to the one registered to Ponce. The barrels of these guns would be nearly identical. Boudreau test-fired the weapons through sticky paper to trap any microscopic particles blown through the barrel. This trace evidence was compared to the residue found on Glee Ewell's clothing. The unusual yellow fibers, the rubber particles, and the steel wool were an exact match.
And it was not difficult to reasonably conclude, yes, there is tennis ball material on Mrs. Ewell's sweatshirt, and it's consistent with the silencer that I constructed based on the information from Detective Souza.
The test bullets closely matched the characteristics of the murder bullets. The rate of twist was correct. The deep scratches were nearly identical to the murder bullets. And finally, the gun extruded the same residue as was found near Glee Ewell. No other type of weapon could have matched so closely. In March 1995, nearly 2 years after the murders, arrest warrants were obtained for Dana Ewell and Joel Radovsich.
Here's the plan.
Based on their extensive investigation, detectives had finally pieced together the whole story. Hungry for his father's fortune, Dana conspired with Joel a year in advance to shoot his family and make it look like a burglary. In exchange, Dana would split the $8 million inheritance with him. While Dana established his perfect alibi 200 miles away, Joel slipped into the Ewell home with a spare key. He shot Dana's sister and mother first, then waited for Dale. They'd figured that without the weapon, they couldn't be tied to the murders. But as cleverly as they'd planned, Dana and Joel's designs weren't bulletproof. Neither man ever confessed. In May of 1998, Ewell and Radovsich were found guilty of 3 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. In the Ewell case, creeping suspicions undermined a tight-lipped conspiracy. Elsewhere, a murder investigation was triggered by an innocent comment.
Allegheny County 911, what's your
On
emergency?
November 7th, 1994, police in Pennsylvania responded to a 911 call from a distraught man named Timothy
Calm
Boskowski.
down, sir. Calm down. What's your address? Lee, we got a detail in Ross Township. It's a white female found in a hot tub.
His wife, Mary Ann, had lost consciousness in the hot tub. He couldn't resuscitate her. Police arrived to see paramedics attempting to revive her.
What happened this evening?
Their efforts failed.
Is she gonna be okay? I was inside, she was out here in the hot tub, and I saw her, and I just...
Her heart stopped as she was rushed to the hospital. The 35-year-old woman was pronounced dead on arrival. She had a .22 concentration of alcohol in her bloodstream.
I'm sure you did, yeah, I do appreciate it.
More than twice the legal limit for intoxication.
Were you aware that my wife drank?
Boskowski told the nurse that Mary Ann had been a heavy drinker and that he blamed the drowning on her alcoholism.
Down some, and she just wouldn't.
You got it?
In Allegheny County, cases of accidental death are police matters, so technicians process the scene. Investigators questioned Boskowski's parents, who'd been called over to babysit while Timothy was at the hospital.
Okay, well... It's a shock. It's really a shock.
Boskowski's father made the comment that this wasn't the first time their son had endured such a tragedy. His first wife, Elaine, had died 4 years earlier, nearly to the day. When Boskowski returned from the hospital, investigators were waiting for him. Boskowski described the incident. Throughout the day and into the evening, he estimated that Mary Ann drank between 13 and 15 cans of beer. Around 11:30 that night, the couple downed a bottle of wine. Mary Ann was an alcoholic, her husband said. Boskowski claimed that Mary Ann stayed in the hot tub after he got out. When he next saw her, he said, she was lying on her side in the water. Detectives searched the house. They found beer in the refrigerator and a bin of empty cans. But these cans were completely dry inside and had obviously been collected over several days. Cans that had been opened that evening would have still held some liquid. The evidence contradicted Boskowski's claim that Mary Ann had consumed beer after beer well into the evening. They also learned that a friend of Mary Ann's had spoken to her on the telephone for an hour and a half earlier that afternoon. The friend said that Mary Ann didn't seem drunk. The more detectives learned, the more they suspected that Mrs. Boskowski's death was no accident, but a case of deadly déjà vu. If Mary Ann Boskowski was murdered in her hot tub, detectives in Pennsylvania had very little physical evidence to prove it. There was no sign of violence found in or around the tub. All they really had were some conflicting statements. Timothy Boskowski agreed to go down to the police station for further questioning. To Detective Jimmy Svedek, his exacting account seemed staged.
One of the things, he was so consistent with his times, too consistent. 10 to 1, I did this. Mary Ann did this at 8 minutes to 1. 5 after 1, I was putting on my shoes.
In this interview with you this afternoon, is that okay? Yeah.
While Boskowski was relating his story, detectives observed a scratch on his neck.
Could you tell me how you got that?
My wife and I went on a cruise, and
They asked him to remove his shirt.
Take a look at this? No. We may even want to take a picture of it. Officer Colby, would
On
you,
his back, they saw a pattern of scratches. Boskowski explained that he and Mary Ann had been on a cruise recently. While in the tub, he had asked her to scratch his sunburned back. Given the suspect's pale skin and the deep gouges, the explanation seemed implausible.
Okay, that's some scratches there, Tim.
These looked like marks from a struggle. When investigators questioned Boskowski about his first wife, his demeanor drastically changed.
Married prior to this lady, is that true?
No, I'd rather not discuss that at all, if that's all right.
He cut the interview short and demanded a lawyer. Without enough information to detain him, he was free to go.
Would like to discuss that?
Not at all.
Investigators immediately contacted law enforcement in Greensboro, North Carolina, where Boskowski and his first wife had lived. They uncovered some uncanny similarities between the two Mrs. Boskowskis. Boskowski had met both wives, Mary Ann and Elaine, in church singles groups.
You looked at this already?
Yeah, I looked at it.
All right. Yeah, she
Both worked as religious school teachers.
Yeah.
They were the exact same weight.
We had such a good time.
Even more chilling were the similarities between their deaths. According to North Carolina police, Boskowski had called 911 on a Sunday night in November, just as he had done in Pennsylvania. Paramedics arrived to find Elaine on the bathroom floor with her husband attempting CPR.
Okay, so we're here.
Can I ask you a few questions about what happened last night?
Sure.
Boskowski claimed that his wife had been drinking heavily that evening, fell unconscious in the tub, and drowned.
Do you know where? Remember where? Okay, you're listening to music. Was that on a tape?
Though detectives in North Carolina were suspicious, they didn't have enough evidence to disprove the husband's account.
So you performed CPR?
Cause of death was left blank on the death certificate. Boskowski was never charged.
I tried to get her to stop, but I mean,
Now, 4 years later, detectives in Pennsylvania were faced with the possibility that their case would end the same way.
To bring it to trial, you need more than just suspicion. You need a case. You got to put the evidence together, and everything has to be there. And they just didn't have what they needed.
Though the bizarre circumstances of his wife's drowning deaths pointed to foul play, it would be a challenge for investigators in Pennsylvania to differentiate an accident from a murder, especially when there were no witnesses. Unless Mary Ann's body had a compelling story to tell, Boskowski would have just washed his hands of another suspicious death. The autopsy began with an inspection of the body. There was no evidence of external trauma, just a few fresh bruises. But the bruising wasn't enough to disprove Boskowski's story. The paramedics might have caused them. The body was next examined for signs of drowning. To Allegheny County Coroner Cyril Wett, it was evident that something had cut off Mary Ann's breathing, but it wasn't water.
These lungs were not wet and heavy at all. And if she had drowned in this tub, I believe that there certainly would have been a fair amount of water into the lungs.
The victim had sustained hemorrhages in her eye and the back of her tongue. The muscle tissue of her neck had sustained deep bruising. All of these were telltale signs of death by strangulation. The coroner concluded that after a rough struggle, someone had wrapped his hands around the victim's neck and squeezed the life out of her. The findings in Pennsylvania caught the attention of John Butts, chief medical examiner of North Carolina. He wondered if Boskowski's first wife, Elaine, had also been asphyxiated 4 years earlier. The autopsy reports showed no indication that she was, but the original examiner might have missed the telltale signs, enabling Boskowski to get away with murder. Elaine's body had been long buried, but photographs remained. Investigators hoped they'd be enough to rectify a grave oversight. 4 years after Elaine Boskowski died in her bathroom, investigators in North Carolina finally had their chance to prove that she'd been murdered. Medical examiner John Butts noticed a strange mark on one of the photographs taken at her autopsy.
One of the important pieces in the puzzle of this case involved some distinctive bruises that were present on Ms. Boskowski's lower chest, upper abdominal region. This was the set of linear or elongated bruises that are illustrated in this photograph.
These parallel bruises, called railroad tracks, matched the shower door railing in the Boskowskis' bathroom. At autopsy, their significance was overlooked. But knowing how Timothy Boskowski had allegedly killed his second wife helped Butts find clues to the death of his first one. She was literally squeezed to death.
This bruise was produced when this woman's abdomen, upper chest region was pushed or compressed down onto the shower track. And again, it was our feeling or our conclusion that that's actually the mechanism of her death.
Based on what North Carolina investigators had turned up, detectives in Pennsylvania looked for more similarities between the two cases. They learned that both of Boskowski's wives were planning to leave the marriage. Neither had yet canceled their life insurance policies that named their husband as beneficiary. It seemed Boskowski felt that killing his wife would solve his financial and romantic problems. When history began to repeat itself with Mary Ann, he resorted to a plan that worked in the past. Thanks to the astute work of investigators in North Carolina and Pennsylvania, the staged drowning of his second wife would be Boskowski's last. In 1996, he was convicted of the murder of Elaine. In 1999, he was sentenced to death for the murder of Mary Ann. Timothy Boskowski's murderous past eventually caught up with him. In New Jersey, police again would have to look backward to solve a death in the family. Early Saturday, March 4th, 1995, a jogger was having a run through East Side Park while most of Paterson, New Jersey still slept. One of its residents had apparently chosen to sleep practically on the jogging path.
Hey, buddy, you all right?
Only a pair of feet stuck out of the sleeping bag. The jogger wondered how the person could breathe and realized the occupant wasn't breathing at all. Police confirmed that the body in the bag was deceased. They interviewed the jogger and fanned out to look for evidence of a possible homicide. The victim was a young female, 18 to 24. She'd been beaten. The sleeping bag interior was blood-stained, but not soap, suggesting she was stuffed into it afterward, probably to move her to this spot. Detective Mike Cassari led the investigation.
We knew it was a murder. We knew that wasn't the original scene. It's just that we were trying to figure out who did it, and that's where the whole thing started.
Most every homicide investigation begins with the victim. In this case, she had no identity. The cause of death was blunt force trauma to the head. The medical examiner found no sign of sexual assault. The blood-stained portions of her clothes were carefully cut away, and the blood tested against the victim's own. If some of it didn't match, investigators hoped that it could be used against a suspected culprit. But all the stains matched the victim's blood. They found neither hide nor hair of any potential suspect. At the New Jersey State Identification Bureau, the victim's fingerprints were run through AFIS, the Automated Fingerprint Identification System. It compares prints from police files all over the country. Within hours, it found a match right in New Jersey. The victim was 18-year-old Tara Carter. Her prints were on file because she had once been arrested for shoplifting. Her parents had moved out of state, but police found her closest relative, her sister. They brought a photo of the victim.
See if you see anybody you recognize.
A friend came to help because she couldn't bring herself to look at it.
Yeah, I recognize her.
They made the ID. Now there was no doubt.
You sure?
Tara Carter was dead. Police learned that Tara said she was going to spend the weekend with her boyfriend. He went by the name Original. She didn't know his real name or where to find him. She also said that Tara had been living with a family friend, a widow named Celestine Payne, and her children. They might know more. Payne lived in a nearby neighborhood where she occasionally rented rooms in her house. Police paid her a visit. Celestine offered to help in any way that she could.
She directed us to the bedroom area where Tara slept with her two daughters. And myself and Detective Reyes looked around. You know, it's common to look for phone books or anything with possible, names of friends or anything, because we had nothing. We didn't have anything to go on to solve this crime at that point.
Oh, no. Wendy, you can't take that.
Tara Carter was treated like a member of Payne's family. She was the best friend of Celestine's daughter, Wendy, with whom she shared the room until Wendy moved to South Carolina.
Got this carpet for
Detectives looked in the closet where Tara kept her belongings.
Yeah, that's all I know.
They found nothing to indicate she was in any kind of trouble with her mysterious boyfriend or with anyone else. When Payne could offer no new information about the victim's boyfriend, Original, police put the word out that they needed to speak with him. In the meantime, they looked for more information about the victim. Payne directed them to the basement, where more of Tara's things were stored.
You know, I think Tara told me. I recall, yeah.
They didn't know what they were looking for until they found it. In one area, drops of blood dotted the basement floor.
Detective Reyes automatically told Miss Payne not to touch anything, that it's possible that the crime happened here. And she again said, well, if it happened here, I want to know about it. This is my house.
See these drops right here?
The amount and position of the blood droplets raised suspicions, but didn't suggest that this was the murder scene. Investigators weren't sure what the drops meant.
And you could see a dripping stain coming down from the rafter. Directly below it was a stain of blood, which indicated that it's possible blood may have dripped from the upstairs into the basement.
You need to go back upstairs and look in there.
Celestine Payne gave her consent to a more thorough search of her house.
She said, I want to know about it. Whatever it takes to figure out, you guys do what you got to do.
While the forensics team was dispatched, detectives continued their investigation. They headed back to the victim's closet, which turned out to be directly over the blood-stained beams. They found blood on the wall and floor of the closet, along with blood-stained women's underwear and other garments. It looked like bloody murder, but investigators had to be sure.
Can you hand me the club bar, please?
Samples were collected and sent to the New Jersey State Police Central Lab, where genetic markers in the blood were scrutinized. These proteins, inherited from our parents, don't change. Though not as precise as DNA testing, genetic marker testing is often sufficient because certain markers are more rare than others. Senior forensic scientist Cynthia McSweeney analyzed the samples from the closet.
And I was able to determine that this blood stain was consistent with only 3% of the black population.
That 3% included the victim, Tara Carter. The evidence proved that she had met her death inside the house.
Well, we just got a few questions.
Celestine Payne accompanied detectives to the station for questioning. She told them that she last saw the victim at 11 a.m. on Friday, March 3rd, the day before her body was found. Tara said she was going to run errands. Celestine and her son had errands of their own to run and were gone most of the day.
How did he get out in the backyard?
When Celestine returned, a man named Charlie Pincham was waiting on the porch. Pincham used to date Celestine's daughter, Wendy, before she moved away. And he was in the habit of stopping by Celestine's house and hanging out. She didn't know where he lived. Because he might have committed the crime while the Paynes were away, Charlie Pincham's name was added to the suspects list. While Celestine answered questions, investigators combed her house for more clues. Besides the bedroom closet, traces of blood were found in the kitchen. The drain pipes were removed and the traps emptied to see what might have accumulated there.
Almost 100 articles of evidence from there, including blood drippings, swabbings. Took the sink apart and removed, later turned out to be skull fragments inside the sink trap, the toilet. There was some hair and matter found inside there. From there, the whole thing exploded. The investigation took off.
By now, the victim's boyfriend, Original, heard police were looking for him and presented himself, along with an alibi. He was off the suspects list, at least for now. That left the equally mysterious Charlie Pincham and the grieving Celestine Payne. But detectives didn't know where Charlie Pincham was, and the forensic evidence didn't necessarily place Celestine Payne at the scene when the murder occurred. This wasn't the first time police had been to Payne's house. While reviewing the case, Detective Sergeant Ronald Humphrey remembered a prior incident.
There was a guy stabbed maybe about a year and a half before that, Eugene Cooper. I remember Eugene living there, but I never got to interview him. He was in intensive care unit at the hospital on a stab wound, and we couldn't get to speak to him.
Upon Cooper's release from the hospital, he refused to press charges and disappeared. Now, 18 months later, detectives tracked Eugene Cooper down to see if there was a connection. Cooper told them that while he lived in the house, Celestine wanted him to sign his life insurance policy over to her. He didn't do it, but let on that he had. Soon after, Charlie Pincham attacked him.
He said that at the time he got stabbed, Charlie was the one that stabbed him, and Celestine Payne that put him up to it.
Cooper didn't go to the police because he was frightened and wanted to put the whole ugly incident behind him. He picked out Pincham's photo from some mugshots. Because Cooper implicated him in this stabbing, it was more important than ever to locate him. Now that Eugene Cooper was talking, he had a lot more to say. And the case took another unexpected twist. He told police that Celestine had set several fires at her house for the insurance money. He also admitted that he helped Celestine move a body, but it wasn't the body of Tara Carter. Tara Carter had been found dead in a sleeping bag, and the investigation into her murder began to disclose other skeletons in Celestine Payne's closet.
Hey, honey.
According to Eugene Cooper, the death of Celestine's husband, Alfonso, years earlier, may not have been accidental. Prior to his death, Alfonso Payne had been suffering from severe hypertension and gout. He was being cared for by his wife, Celestine. In 1991, his body was found in a field across town. At the time, Alfonso's death was considered to be accidental, that he was doing drugs, wandered away, and collapsed. Now, 3.5 years later, Eugene Cooper told New Jersey police that he'd helped Celestine and her children dump Alfonso Payne's body on the other side of town. With Cooper's new information, detectives pulled Alfonso's medical records and autopsy report. They found that before his death, he had been too ill to even get out of bed, let alone get across town. The autopsy showed that the drugs in his system at the time of death weren't those prescribed for his medical condition, but high dosages of 5 kinds of tranquilizers and antidepressants, all prescribed for Celestine.
Hey, can you lift the bed up?
Yeah, sure.
Investigators had enough to get another search warrant for Payne's home. They found that besides the policy on her husband, Alfonso, and for fire damage, Payne also managed to get one on Eugene Cooper, even without his signature. It appeared that Celestine Payne may have killed her husband, and once again, insurance seemed to be the motive. They also found a policy on Tara Carter's life.
Looks like a couple of insurance.
This was strange because, like Cooper, she wasn't related to Payne. The policy provided a possible motive,
Eugene Cooper, I don't
but not
recognize
enough
that
evidence to arrest Celestine for murder.
You have the right to talk to a lawyer and have him present with you while you're being
By this
questioned.
time, Charlie Pincham had been found and arrested for stabbing Eugene Cooper. Eventually, he admitted to it, saying that Celestine Payne put him up to it. Then, investigators asked him what he knew about the Tara Carter murder. He said he was there and tried to stop it, but Celestine Payne killed her. Afterward, he admitted helping her move the body, using a car she rented. They had what they needed to arrest Celestine Payne.
Put your hands behind your back.
Then they tracked down the rental car. Cynthia McSweeney tested the trunk for traces of blood and found nothing. But her job wasn't finished. Her tests of the liner below the trunk carpet yielded different results.
When I analyzed the liner and did get a positive result, I began to think that perhaps the person had tried to clean up the area but had not done a thorough job.
As before, a genetic marker analysis of the blood proved it belonged to the victim, Tara Carter. Its presence in the trunk of a car rented by Celestine Payne linked the suspect to the crime.
You've got a pretty good racket.
Despite the evidence, she flatly denied any wrongdoing.
I know he lied.
Like
He
many
wanted me to-
women
No,
who
he
kill,
wanted me
she
to
hoped
sleep
her
with him, but I
charm
wouldn't do
could
it.
mask her
To
guilt.
talk to a lawyer and have him present with you while any questions.
Detective Michael Casari didn't buy it.
Decide to answer any questions.
Celestine was a devious woman. She would look at you and say, "Child, I didn't do this murder," and almost melt into you. You know, I had nothing to do with this. I would never hurt anybody. And she's using her kids to kill people, including her own father. She's killing her friends. She's killing family people. She's evil. That's only one word to put, an evil woman.
She passed that evil on to her daughter.
Oh, no, thank you.
Investigators learned that while Wendy pretended to be Tara's best friend, she also pretended to be Tara, at least long enough to sign a life insurance policy in Tara Carter's name.
Oh, yeah.
Hi, Tara. Have a good night. Have a good night.
Once the policy was in effect, Tara Carter's days were numbered. The unwitting victim, lured into a false sense of security in Payne's home,
Hair looks so
was
pretty.
marked for death.
You look pretty.
It came quickly. Pincham admitted using a crowbar. Her body was stashed in the upstairs closet until it could be bundled and moved safely without being detected. Ultimately, the forensics clinched the case, and even Celestine Payne couldn't deny it. The bloodstains, the financial motive, and the opportunity all pointed to Payne, her daughter Wendy, and Charlie Pincham. When faced with the evidence, they plea bargained. Celestine Payne and Charlie Pincham received life, and Wendy Payne received 28 years. To solve some homicides, investigators need look no further than the victim's own home. But just because a suspect is a relative doesn't mean the case will be solved with relative ease. A killer in the home will take greater care to cover his tracks. It's up to forensics to make sure that deadly secrets don't stay buried in family plots.